Hello, fellow solvers. This is Cog with Cog Analytics, and today we are answering your Alteryx questions. Looking at a post in the Designer Desktop discussion board, calculate sum by transaction number and order number shared by Jocelyn Up. So thank you for posting. Now, ultimately, the question is, given an input data set, how can we generate a sum via a grouping where the logic for grouping records is that if a single field shares a value with another record among a collection of fields, those records become a group. To demonstrate that and hopefully make that make a little bit more sense, in this case, our key fields are the transaction number and order number fields. So we can see here records 1 and 2 would form a group because the order number is shared between them. And in this case, we can see transaction number 5691 is down here again, 5691. And so these records too would form a group. So ultimately what we can get is a kind of tree-based structure where we are going from node to node in order to identify which records form a group. You can have records that have no groups or just one or two records in a group. Similarly, like you can see in this first problem, there are many records that all form one group. So an interesting problem coming up with how to generate this group ID. The logic is a little bit complex, requiring the use of an iterative macro. With that, let's dive in and take a look at the workflow and see how to put that together. So we have our input via the text input tool. This is our sample data. We have the transaction number and order number fields, and we also have our amount that we will be summing. Now, the main thing I want to showcase for y'all is how to create this group. But of course, in answering your questions, we will format the output appropriately as well. So in order to generate the group, you can see here I have a macro where a user can select which fields are the key fields, and then a grouping will be generated accordingly. If we expand the results pane here, we can see that exactly as we had in our input, this bulk of records is all group ID 1, and then we have the couple record groups and that last record again all by itself. So how do we generate this group ID? So the first thing we do is utilize a standard macro to prep the data for the iterative macro that I mentioned earlier. In order to do that, we have our interface tools so that the user can select the key fields. We also select off those key fields. Then in this multi-field formula tool, just to ensure that we don't get any weird warnings or errors with the join, we set everything that was selected to a string. Then we transpose the data. This is an important step. This gives us now the ability to self-join, where we're looking for any matches across the name and value. What this means in the event that a join occurs is that we have, let's go back one step. So for example, with test B, if we see the value 1 twice, then we know that records 2 and 1 should be part of the same group. And so with that information, we can perform these joins. And what we get out is a mapping of all connected records. Now, this is not the most useful. There's a lot of redundancy here, so we can see a lot of self-joins, as well as reciprocal mapping. So 2 connects to 3, as well as 3 connects to 2. We can resolve this and simplify our mapping by using the summarize tool. And the aggregation that we're going to do is grouping by the first set of records, which we'll call our from, and we will group that to the minimum of the to field. And so what we see here now is we have a unique mapping from a single record to whatever its target record is, one step down the chain. Now the problem with this, what we can already see is that we're forming what looks like a group ID. So we can see 4 goes to 4, 5 goes to 4, and 6 goes to 4. So these are all connected. But the problem is that we have some extra information here. For example, you can see record 7 maps to 3, but 3 maps to 2, and 2 ultimately maps to record 1. But we don't want that. We want to know that row 7 maps to row 1. So we want to know its final destination. And so with this information, we can then utilize an iterative macro to perform that calculation. Now, this is something, there are weekly challenges that have a very similar structure to this problem. And I don't believe there is a way to solve this without an iterative macro. If you are aware of one, please comment down below and let me know. I'd love to learn something new today. But otherwise, there are many ways to set up this iterative macro. I will showcase my approach to the solution. We will jump into the final destination macro. So we take our input, which is that same mapping. So we have our from and our to fields. And ultimately, we're doing so our self join is going to identify the next destination. So we're taking one step in the mapping. You can see here in this kind of crude sketch, we have basically the first step from to goes from 3 in our example, record 3 maps to record 2, but also at the same time, we know record 2 maps to record 1. So via the transitive property, we know that 3 should map to 1. And so this is exactly what we are calculating with this join. You can see here we have the from, we have to, and we have new to. The way this is done in the self join is instead of joining on the same field, we're going to join the to on the left input to the from the right. And so this is exactly here, this middle column right here is what we're joining on in order to identify this second step, so to speak. And so with this information, we can do the very first thing is to check whether or not we need to iterate again. So every iteration in this macro is going to have all of the data in it. So in many cases, when you build an iterative macro, what you're going to end up doing is trying to whittle down the records until there's nothing left to iterate on. That is a very useful way of building an iterative macro, but it's not the only way that you can build an iterative macro. In this case, again, like I said, we're going to iterate on all the records the entire time until we're done iterating, at which point this check will return no records and we will get no output to the next iteration step, and all of the data will output to the complete. So in this case, nothing gets outputted from our macro, from our iterative macro, until everything is done, in which case everything is output and nothing left goes through the iteration process. So you can see here what we're checking for is to see if the new step, the new field, is the same as the original field. In this case, it's not, so we know that we're still making progress. Once it is the case that all of the fields are mapping to the same target destination, then we are at the final destination for all records. And so this is why we're looking for, in this case, we're checking the count, append that back to the data. So you can see here we have a single field with one unified value that's shared across all records. This is a key aspect of performing iterative macros this way. And so now we can check, does count equal 0? If it does, then we're done with the process. If it doesn't, then there are still records that we're processing and we want to pass all the data back through the next step. And so you can see here, once we know that we still have work to do, then we update the to field with whatever the new value was. So we're capturing and solidifying that next step. And now they match. We format our iteration to be the same as the input, and we're good to iterate. This is a pretty simple iterative macro. Again, this is in several weekly challenges in various forms. I will post a link in the description to one of the variations of this problem on the weekly challenges, in addition to the link to the original problem. So this is all we need. Once this is done, we'll have our output, which is, as we can see, the output from our final destination macro. So now this is the terminal step for all records. So if you recall before, we look at our summarize tool, we knew 7 mapped to 3, 3 mapped to 2, and 2 mapped to 1. Now after our macro, we can see that 7 just maps to 1. So this is exactly what we need. All we have is the final destination for each record. And again, we have all records accounted for in our from field. So we can use the tile tool to configure this mapping to reindex it so that we have what we're going to call the group ID. So with the tile tool, we get 2 fields. We really only need this tile num, and we can see already we have a beautifully indexed set. And here lies the group ID. So we can use the select tool to rename that field and isolate down to only those that we need. The from, again, is all of the record IDs, and group ID is our final output. We can join this back into the original data, sort so that the output matches the input, and what we're left with is just the original data with that group ID that we were looking for. So this is kind of the ultimate or the core problem I wanted to showcase for y'all. As far as answering the original question, one more key element to this problem is not just grouping on these fields, but performing the sum in such a way that we avoid adding these redundant amounts based on transaction number. The way to do that is once we have this grouping, of course, we can use two summarize tools. I can link, I did a deep dive into the summarize tool if you're interested. You can check that out after this. And I highlight there that in many cases, or not many cases, but in some cases, it will be useful not to just do one aggregation step, but to do two in order to accomplish more than you can do with just one summarize tool. So in this case, the first thing we're going to do is group on the group ID that we just calculated, as well as transaction number. And all we want is the first occurrence of amount. That way we don't get any of the duplicates, like this 8051, for example. You can see beforehand, we have this amount here for 5691. Scroll a little bit down, record 7 has exactly the same amount for that transaction number. And now we only have one occurrence after this first summarize tool, and then the second summarize tool we can actually do the aggregation. So we'll again on the group ID, we'll group by that, and then we'll sum up the total amount to get our final output that we can join to the original data set. And that concludes this workflow. You can see we have our transaction number, our order number, the amount originally, and then per the user's request, we have the aggregated total amount for all records based on this group ID that we calculated with an iterative macro. Anyways, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any questions yourself that you'd like answered, please post in the comments. If you think you can solve this better, please share. As I said before, I'm always down to learn new, better ways to approach these problems. Anyways, as always, I hope this helps, and happy solving.